Last Sam's Cage by David A. Poulsen, Chapter 11, page 114. June 4, evening. I don't remember everything about the day my dad was buried, and what I do remember is stuff that isn't worth much. But every time I think about that day, it sort of jumps out at me. There was a fly. I couldn't see it at first, but I could hear it buzz. It wasn't normal. It was like the fly was stumbling around along instead of flying steady. Then I saw it. Up by the light, it wasn't supposed to be there. Not that day. Not just then. Too young to die. That was what everybody said. They said it so many times I couldn't get the words to stop buzzing around in my head. Buzzing. The fly moved over to the window. I was wishing that someone would open the window and let it out. I kept watching the fly and listening to its soft droning and its body hitting up against the glass. I didn't hear much of what Reverend Whitaker was saying, except I heard when he said my dad was too young to die. I wished someone would let me out too. I hated the little room they put us in, and I hated the curtain that was stretched across in front of us. It was white and I could see through it, but everything was fuzzy, so I couldn't make out the faces of the people who were there. About the only thing I could see clearly was the coffin. I wasn't supposed to call it a coffin. Everybody else called it a casket. I guess that's supposed to be a nicer word or something, but at that time, I didn't much care about the nicer words for everything about dying. I just wanted somebody to tell me how we were going to go camping without my dad to take us. Coffin, casket, coffin. It didn't matter as I was sitting there. I had the sudden and really clear memory of my dad, not of him exactly, but of something he used to say. I was afraid of the dark when I was little, not just a little bit afraid either. I was pretty much terrified on those nights that I lay in my bed crying. My dad would come in and sit on my bed. He wouldn't say much most of the time. He'd just sit with his hand on my shoulder, and I'd feel better just having him there. But before he'd leave, he'd always say, "I'm here, Eddie, always and always." That was the part I liked, the always and always part. Hearing those words made me feel that no matter how scared or alone I was, my dad would be a part of me forever. The fly was still after a while, not pestering the glass anymore to get out. I figured it must have given up. The funeral was in Long Prairie, not far from the house where we used to live. I think my dad would have liked the idea of being buried there and not in the city. After he was buried, everybody went over to the Elks Hall for some lunch. People kept coming by where my mom and I were sitting to tell us how sorry they were and to give us hugs and pats. A couple of my aunts and some of our old neighbors had made sandwiches and little cakes and stuff. I asked Mom if I could go for a walk, and she said I could. I went to the park. The park was only 2 streets over, and when I got there, the place was pretty well empty. In fact, the only person I saw was Mrs. Clara Campbell. She was sitting on the bench with a faded paint right next to the tallest cottonwood tree in the whole park. I knew it had to be between 3 and 4 o'clock because Mrs. Clara Campbell always went to the park right at 3 o'clock and left exactly at 4. Even though we'd been gone for 2 years, that part of life in Long Prairie hadn't changed, and she always sat on the bench while the faded paint right next to that big cottonwood. Everybody who had ever lived in the town knew about Mrs. Clara Campbell in the park, just like they knew Mary Jo Bender and Rory Wenzel. Met every night under the railroad bridge and did it on the grass next to the creek. And everybody knew that Gerald Coughlin was the one who took Mr. Barnaby's Datsun and parked it on the front steps of the school for April Fools. There's stuff you know when you live in a place. Sometimes Mrs. Clara Campbell read while she was at the park. Sometimes she just sat and looked straight ahead. There were lots of things to see in the park, the kind of stuff you'd think an old lady like Mrs. Clara Campbell would have liked. There were squirrels, lots of them. There were the fountain with the boy and the trumpet that spouted water, and there were even some nice flowers here and there. But Mrs. Clara Campbell never looked at any of those things, at least not any of the times I'd seen her. She read or she looked straight ahead, and straight ahead from where Mrs. Clara Campbell sat on the bench, there wasn't anything at all to see. I never heard her call anything about Mrs. Clara Campbell. I don't remember anybody ever saying Clara or even Mrs. Campbell. A lot of times when us kids said it, we made it sound funny with sing-song voices or whiny voices or some other voices that were meant to make fun of her. But even when we were making fun, we called her Mrs. Clara Campbell. A couple of times we talked about going to the park, the whole gang of us, at about 2:45 and staying there until after 3 o'clock. We wanted to see what she'd do if her bench was taken when she got there. Kids think about stuff like that during summer holidays. We talked about it a few times, but we never did it. I don't know why I wanted to talk to her that day. I'd never spoken to her before. Maybe I did when I was a real little kid and my mom drove us into town and took me for a walk in the park. Little kids aren't shy about things like talking to old ladies, even ones that are kind of crazy. Mrs. Clara Campbell was supposed to be crazy. That's what people said. Mostly it was other kids who said it, so I didn't totally believe it. I learned pretty early on that you can't believe a whole lot of what kids tell you, or adults either. I did believe it a little bit, though, because Mrs. Clara Campbell did some strange things. I don't mean always sitting on the same bench and always arriving at the park at the same time of day. She did some stranger things than that. Once she spent Christmas morning hoeing in the garden. She had to sweep the snow off first so she could see the dirt. Then she stood there for most of the morning, jabbing away at the frozen ground. We heard about it from Joyce Tanner, who lived in the next house over. My dad said it was just because she was so lonely being all by herself at Christmas. You couldn't necessarily believe what my dad said either, because he always made excuses for people. To me, hoeing in the garden on December 25th is goofy behavior. And that wasn't all. Another time she got on the phone and called every single person in the area to tell them she had just seen the first robin of the year. People who lived in the country had party lines back in those days, and a lot of them were ready to hang her from that tall cottonwood in the park for tying up the phone for most of the day. She just started at a and kept calling until she got through to everybody in the phone book. After a few hours of it, word had gotten around. Some of the people who hadn't been called yet left their phones off the hook to dodge the call. But when they hung up their phones before they went to bed, it wasn't 15 minutes before Mrs. Clara Campbell had them on the other end of the line telling them about that bird. That happened when I was only 2 or something, but I remember people still talking about it when I was quite a bit older. So she was crazy all right, at least some of the time, but I still wanted to talk to her. I just felt like it, not because she was lonely. Who knows? Maybe she wasn't. I wanted to talk to Mrs. Clara Campbell for me, not for her. Mrs. Clara Campbell, I spoke softly so I wouldn't scare her. I know you, Master Eddie Slater, she said, which I thought was kind of a strange way to start a conversation, and nobody had ever called me Master before. Yes, ma'am. I came around to the bench and stood where she could see me if she turned her head a little ways to the left. She didn't, though. She just kept looking straight ahead like always. I heard about your father. Her voice didn't sound like any of the ones we used to when we were making fun of her. Yes, ma'am, the funeral was today. Yes. She didn't say he was too young to die, or he was a fine man, or any of the other stuff people had been saying to my mom and me all day long. In fact, yes was the last thing Mrs. Clara Campbell ever said to me about my father dying. It might sound strange, but she was pretty in a way which you don't really expect in old people. She was quite small and thin, but her skin was mostly smooth and her eyes seemed clear and sharp, like she could see as good as anybody if her head hadn't been stuck in that one spot. She had on a light blue skirt and a little jacket thing that matched it. The skirt was fairly long, it almost made it to the ground. I thought she must be kind of hot with that jacket on. I noticed that there was a little bit of moisture on her upper lip. That reminded me of that when I was kind of hot myself from having to wear a tie and have my shirt buttoned all the way up to the top. I took off the tie and shoved it in my pocket. One thing about Mrs. Clara Campbell not turning her head to look at you, it was kind of handy if you wanted to stare at her. That's what I was doing. Even with that drop of sweat on her lip, I still thought she looked very clean. From where I was standing, she smelled like flowers and apples, but maybe that was just the park. I thought I should say something else, and I wanted to talk to her some more, but I couldn't think of anything else to say. I guess I wasn't used to having conversations with people like Mrs. Clara Campbell. I was starting to think about going somewhere else when I noticed her eyes flick a little in my direction. Not all the way so she was looking right at me, just a little closer to where I was standing. Then she said, "He clasps the crag with crooked hands, close to the sun in lonely lands. Ringed with the azure world he stands. The wrinkled sea beneath him crawls. He watches from his mountain walls, and like a thunderbolt he falls." Mrs. Clara Campbell's eyes flicked back to straight ahead when she finished. "That's dot dot dot. A nice poem, Mrs. Clara Campbell. Real nice. Did you write it?" The funny thing was, I actually did think it was a nice poem. I didn't know exactly what it was about, but I liked it, and I liked that Mrs. Clara Campbell just up and started reciting a poem, the way she had. I remember thinking that was kind of special. No. It wasn't a big smile, but it was enough to make me feel that maybe I'd said the right thing. I got to wondering if the books she always read when she came to the park were poetry books. I don't know anybody who read poetry, not even my dad, who had liked to read a lot. That was the first time I had thought about my dad for a while. When I'd been talking to Mrs. Claire Campbell, I kind of forgot to think about him. I wasn't sure if that was a proper thing to do on the day he was being buried. I had plenty of time to wonder about it because Mrs. Claire Campbell didn't say anything more. Not for a long time. I started to feel pretty stupid standing there right next to her, neither of us saying anything, but she didn't seem to mind. My legs began to hurt because I was keeping them real tense. I guess I was sort of nervous. I figured it was my turn to say something, but I wasn't sure how to talk to somebody who spoke poems. I guess I should be going, Mrs. It's about an eagle, she said so sudden. It made me jump. Tennyson was writing about an eagle, or had you figured that out? Dot. No, ma'am. I mean, I wasn't exactly sure. I hear you're something of a writer yourself, Master Slater. Well, dot. Not really. No, I wouldn't say I was. I knew what she was talking about. I'd won an essay contest for the children and grandchildren of war veterans a couple of months before. I got $50 for a prize, and they put my picture in the Long Prairie paper one of those former resident of the town does such and such stories. I guess that's how she knew. To tell the truth, I had spent a lot of time wishing I hadn't won that contest. When I got to school the day after my picture was in the paper, a lot of the kids were all over me about being a sissy writer. I wound up fighting a kid named Clark Morrison. He beat me up pretty good, but at least it got the rest of them off my back about that essay. I was hoping everybody had forgotten about it by now. Yes, I understand you're a very good writer, Mr. Slater. Very good. For the first time since I'd won the stupid contest, I actually felt good about it. I mean, I was kind of excited when I first saw the words I'd written on the page of the Veterans magazine, but that wore off pretty quick. Once I got to school, in a way, I couldn't really blame the kids for saying all the stuff they said. It was just an essay. It wasn't like I'd scored the winning goal in a hockey game or something. I figured I wouldn't bother writing anymore. Of course, my parents and my teacher were all excited about me winning, but you'd expect that Mrs. Clara Campbell was the only person other than them who really seemed to think that being a good writer was okay. About your great-grandfather, I believe, is that correct? Yes, ma'am. He was killed at a place called Vimy Ridge. Yes, I knew him. For a minute I thought she was going to turn her eyes my way again, but she didn't. Well done, Master Slater. Well done. This time she didn't wait as long before she started talking again. There were eagles here once. And just as easy as anything, she tilted her head upward as if to look at the place where they had been. I'd already decided there was something wrong with her neck, so I was a little surprised at how easy she moved it. I looked up to where she was looking. Oh, I said. Many years ago, hundreds of them, bald eagles, goldens, they passed through here in the spring on their way to the summer nesting grounds in the north. I loved to watch them. They'd stop off here for a month or so in March and into April. That was before it got built up around here. They still come through. Oh, but did you know that? They still come in the spring and they still stay for a month, but not here. South and west of here they still come. That must be... Have you ever seen an eagle? Her head was still tilted up as she was squinting like the sun was hurting her eyes. It seemed pointless to me to stare off at where the eagles used to be, but weren't anymore. No, ma'am, except in pictures and on TV. Seen lots of hawks and some owls before we moved to the city, but no eagles, not yet. No, she said. I figured that was the end of our chat, but I stood there a while longer in case she wanted to tell me anything else about the eagles or recite another poem. But she didn't. Well, bye, I said. It was nice talking to you. She brought her head back down then, and I wasn't sure, but I thought she nodded just the littlest bit. I turned to leave. I wasn't sure what I was going to report to the other kids about my conversation with Mrs. Clara Campbell. Some of the kids I had known when we lived in Long Prairie had come to the funeral and were probably still at the Elks Hall, loading up on the sandwiches and stuff. I didn't know if I could tell them whether she was crazy or not. Talking about eagles and stuff that happened a long time ago didn't prove anything. That's what old people did. Of course, the way she talked about things was a little strange. What with the poems and not saying anything at all for a long time and never looking at you. But I still couldn't say for sure if Mrs. Clara Campbell was actually crazy. I decided it might be best not to say anything at all talking to her. At least not right away. I'd only gone a few steps when her voice stopped me. "Adventure!" she said. I stopped and looked back. She was turned completely around on that bench, staring right at me. Her eyes were narrow like two small lights shining out of her face. Shining right at me. At the end of summer I am going to take part in an adventure, she told me. I'm going to the northern tip of British Columbia to a place where eagles, hundreds of them, stay all year round. That sounds really nice. Then she had what I figured was the strangest part of our talk. Have you ever had a real adventure in your whole life, Master Slater? I didn't get a chance to answer because Mrs. Clara Campbell got up from the bench and started off the same direction she always went when she left the park. I looked at my watch. 4 o'clock. Mrs. Clara Campbell never got to that place to see the eagles. She died a few weeks before she was supposed to go. Mom told me that when people went into Mrs. Clara Campbell's house to take care of her stuff, they found a copy of my essay taped onto her fridge door. It still seems odd to me that the thing I remember most about the day of my dad's funeral was that time with Mrs. Clara Campbell. That and the fly.